50 books in 2025, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the books that I read in December. I started off with All Fours by Miranda July, and that was a book that there's been a fair amount of buzz about for the past year or so, and I don't normally read books that are kind of the moment, just because I find that I either go in with really high expectations and I get disappointed, or I go in like automatically with kind of a grudge against the book because I can be a little contrarian when it comes to things like that. But a friend recommended this one to me and I saw it at the library, so I checked it out. All I knew about this book going in was that it is about a woman who is going through a divorce and that the book is a little bit saucy. The narrator in All Fours is an unnamed 45-year-old woman who is some kind of somewhat successful and acclaimed artist. She's dissatisfied with her relationship, though she appreciates how she and her partner work together to raise their child. And at the beginning of the novel, she plans on going on a road trip from California to New York, partially just to prove to others that she's the type of person who would do that. But she ends up not making it on the road trip and staying at a motel about half an hour away from where she lives. The rest of the novel unfurls as she makes decisions that reveal some of her fears and curiosities about aging, about womanhood, about her art, about her sexuality. I liked how this book broached perimenopause, which is a life stage that I realized I didn't know that much about, despite its apparent intensity and complexity. As a reader, you're deeply inside the narrator's head, and with this book that ended up kind of going both ways for me. At times I loved hearing her pithy, judgmental, yet funny observations of the world around her. At other times I felt really suffocated by her inner monologue and her choices, which I often didn't understand, or if I did understand them, just felt so distant from things that I had felt and experienced in a way that I often found frustrating or hard to witness. Her decision making and lack of communication at times can be really frustrating, especially since as the reader we were so ingrained in her head, and I often found myself just feeling like, why are you doing this? In a way that I didn't love. Something I appreciated was how information about her childhood was incorporated. She had a childhood with a lot of upsetting, traumatic, uncomfortable events, but we don't hear all about it. You sort of get those anecdotes or moments sprinkled in throughout, almost casually, in a way that I thought was really effective, so that we see sort of where some of her thoughts, neuroses, etc. come from, but that wasn't the focus of the book, and that felt very real to me, and I thought added a lot of complexity to the already layered and complex protagonist. But in general, I think this is a book that really brings you along with this narrator, whether you like it or not. And I personally wasn't crazy about it, but I had lots of friends who loved it, who laughed out loud, who really got something from this book. So I wouldn't say that I disliked it. Definitely didn't love it though. But if you're curious about it, I would recommend checking it out. It's worth a read, even if it might not be your cup of tea. The second book I read in December was Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Sometimes when I read a contemporary novel, I like to then read an older book afterwards and kind of mix and match like that, just so that I'm getting a variety of voices and ways of writing and storytelling. Orlando was written or published in 1928, and it was the second Virginia Woolf novel that I've read, the first being To the Lighthouse. While I really appreciated some of the moments of prose in To the Lighthouse, I don't feel like I fully got it. I found it pretty hard to get into. It was a little bit slow for me, but I did really like some moments of the writing and the overall feeling of the novel, and so I was interested to try a different Virginia Woolf novel to get a little more insight and maybe something that felt a little bit more approachable. Luckily, Orlando was just the thing. I think it's actually known for being one of Woolf's most accessible texts, and that was definitely the case for me. So Orlando starts out as the story of a young nobleman living in Elizabethan England, and he has a series of adventures and goes on journeys, but the big turning point in the book comes when he changes from being a man to a woman. Orlando also lives for several centuries, and both this and the sudden gender shift are treated as kind of like feasible and reasonable parts of the novel. They're not like causes for alarm or seen as supernatural or anything like that within the context of the novel. The novel's format was pretty interesting because it's written like a satirical biography. So you have this omniscient narrator's voice that is acting as a biographer, and sometimes little asides and commentaries made me chuckle, which I realize I don't actually often do when I'm reading. I don't usually like laugh or chuckle out loud. This book was really special in the way that it handles time. We all experience time differently, and the relative speed of moments or experiences and the duration can feel so different between one person to the next. And something that I thought this novel did really effectively was flowing between capturing decades at a time to focusing in on single tiny moments. And the way that she incorporates memory and reflection through the perspective of the main character really highlights her handling of time, and was part of what made this book feel really compelling to me. Obviously, this book is also about gender and about how Orlando's life is different as a man than as a woman, both in terms of how other people treat Orlando as well as his and her own thoughts, feelings, approaches to life and relationships and themselves. This book also has a lot of beautiful passages just on a prose level, and a lot of really vivid, moving descriptions. The copy that I had also had a pretty detailed foreword that explained that this book was written as a tribute to Virginia Woolf's lover, Vida Sackville West, and that the character of Orlando was based on Vida. Not only some details about like her family lineage, but also just like who she was as a person, as an artist. And so I thought that was pretty cool that we have a whole novel that is sort of like a personal wink to somebody that she loves. And it made me curious to know a little bit more about Vida Sackville West and their relationship. I've read some excerpts of letters, I think, that they've exchanged, but I'm definitely curious to read up a little bit more on that. But yeah, overall, I really loved Orlando. It made me think, it made me journey around in time and space, and I would definitely recommend this one. The next book was Disgrace by J.M. Coetzee. This was published in 1999, and I picked this up at the library as well. This is a book that I had definitely like flipped through multiple times before at the library, but ultimately put down because something about it like intimidated me, or I felt it would be too heavy, despite the fact that it's not very long. I just had the sense that it was like a really serious book, and it is, but I did actually end up really liking it. Disgrace takes place in South Africa around the turn of the century, so a few years after the end of apartheid. And it follows a professor who is not that good at his job and is unhappy. He's divorced. He's kind of just like floating through his life. And he ends up having a relationship with a student that goes awry. And he leaves Cape Town to live in the countryside with his adult daughter. She is like, I don't know if homesteading is the right word, but she is kind of scrabbling out a tough life on a farm. And him moving in there kind of begins to reveal some tensions within their relationships. But then a big thing happens that really brings to the forefront these tender spots in their relationships, as well as in their relationship to South Africa as white South Africans, and in this really tumultuous time politically, socially, culturally. They have to grapple with their understanding of themselves and others as the ground kind of shifts beneath them in this new world order. I liked this book. There were definitely moments in there that made me squirm, that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that I thought was really effective. The title is apt. It is about disgrace. It is also about shame and justice and power. I think the book does a really good job interweaving these themes throughout the plot and also leaving space for the reader to make interpretations and come to conclusions on their own, but through these moments that are often uncomfortable, dark, kind of hard to read. In some ways, it did feel like a rather male book. Like the perspective, of course, like I said, the protagonist, the main character is a man, but just how he thinks and operates in the world was like, oh, he's a man. But I did find it thought-provoking and challenging on more of a thematic, ideological level, because the prose is actually very straightforward and flows easily throughout the reading. This was the second book that I read that took place in South Africa this year, which I thought was kind of an interesting happenstance, and it also made me want to read more about South Africa. I would recommend this one, but I would also say tread lightly. There are definitely some triggering moments and challenging themes, so you definitely need to be ready to grapple with violence, sexism, racism, obviously, among other things. So if you are not feeling up to that, maybe skip this one for now, but I thought it was a good book. Up next, we've got Flights by Olga Tokarczuk. I was actually looking for a different book by this author, but I saw this on the shelf and I'd never heard of it, which I felt a little surprised by because I was vaguely familiar with the author, that this was my first book of hers, but this won the International Man Booker Prize, and I didn't realize Tokarczuk had won the Nobel Prize in Literature. So that surprised me a little, but made me excited to get into this. This is Flights, and it was published in the English translation was published in 2017. Flights is written as a series of vignettes about travel and the human body, I would say, are two of the main themes. I love books that are written in vignettes. I find that really compelling, readable style. Not always, but when you're in the mood, it hits. And I also have traveled a lot in my life and was excited to kind of read some reflections or meditations on that theme. Some of the vignettes are directly related to one another and are part of telling like a larger story, but others are standalone or kind of supplementary or auxiliary to the longer vignettes. And I definitely found some of them more compelling and interesting than others. The vignettes were sort of, like I said, about travel and the human body, but sort of about travel philosophy and what the psyche of the traveler is, the kind of unique state one is in when one is a traveler, and then the human body. The human body theme was pretty interesting because it was about like preservation of the human body, and not in the sense of like anti-aging or preventative care or anything like that, but like literally preserving body parts, like suspended in fluid and plastification and things like that. And there's honestly more of that than I was anticipating, and sometimes I was not finding that as compelling and honestly even grossed me out a little bit at times. So there were definitely types of stories and vignettes that I was more interested in or like wanted to read, and other ones that I was kind of like, okay, you know. But overall I really liked it. I liked her writing style. It was a relatively smooth and engaging read. I found myself wanting to pick it up. I'd be curious to see how her writing translates into kind of more typical novel style and not vignettes. So definitely an author I want to continue reading from, but if you're interested in travel or you like vignettes in general, I'd recommend this one. It was a solid read. Up next we have Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. I've been wanting to read Jamaica Kincaid for a while, so again, this is another one I just kind of came across at the library and picked up, and I'm glad I did. It also didn't hurt that this book was pretty short. It's about 148 pages, and I actually normally don't really discriminate based on length and size, but it was getting towards the end of December and I was scrabbling a little to meet my goal, so it was well timed. But despite its small stature, this book birthed a larger-than-life character. This is about the eponymous Annie John, who is growing up in Antigua, and her story is apparently loosely somewhat based on the life of the author. The story is told through a series of longer vignettes in which we learn about Annie John's friendships, her scholastic aptitude, as well as her complex relationship with her mother. I was really struck at how this book expressed the ways in which a girl's relationship to her mother is sort of both a mirror and a foil to her relationship to herself. Sometimes she's identifying with her mother, sometimes she's juxtaposed against her, and sometimes, paradoxically, both at once. There were some really beautiful and touching moments of love and tenderness, and then also moments of intense angst and lack of understanding and communication. In the novel, she also describes kind of the sights and smells of daily life, especially through the eyes of a child, in a way that was really compelling. She really captures the fear and disgust and joy and curiosity and discovery and all of that mishmash of feelings that come with adolescence and a changing mind and body. Her perspective feels so real, and even reading it as an adult, there were times where I was like, oh my god, can't you just like see this from another perspective? But at the same time, because of the realness of that perspective, I was like, dang, I remember feeling that way exactly. So this is a great book. I would highly recommend. And shout out to Jamaica Kincaid. I am excited to read more from her. And my last book of 2025 was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This was published in 2020 and has sort of come back into the zeitgeist because there is a movie coming out, or I guess probably already came out, that I think has a lot of buzz around it, Paul Mescal, etc., etc. I picked this one up because my sister really liked it and I was going to see her over the holidays, so I wanted to be able to talk about it. I would say she and I have like 80% similar taste in books. She has recommended me, I think she was the person who recommended the Neapolitan Quartet to me, which ended up becoming some of my favorite, most cherished books ever. And we love talking about those still, even though we both read them like years ago. But she also didn't like Wuthering Heights, which is one of my favorites, so there are times we differ, and this was a moment of a slight difference of opinion for us. So Hamnet is a reimagining of a particular moment in Shakespeare's life. The story follows Shakespeare, his wife, who we normally know as Anne Hathaway, but in this she's called Agnes or Agnes, their daughters Susanna and Judith, and their son Hamnet. So in the novel, Hamnet dies from the plague at age 11, and Shakespeare goes on to write the play Hamlet 3 or 4 years later. This also isn't really a spoiler. One, because it happened in real life. Two, you find out like right away. Although in real life we don't know whether or not he died from the plague, but that's just what historians have assumed. The Shakespeare connection is sort of the hook of the book, but it's not really about Shakespeare himself. It's really more about Agnès, the wife. In fact, Shakespeare isn't even named in the book ever. He's just referred to as like the father, the son, the playwright, which I thought was pretty cool. But yeah, it really is about Agnès and her life and her feelings. She's kind of this half-wild, witchy woman who is really in touch with nature and who knows how to use herbs and plants and things like that for remedies. And she also has this kind of sense of intuition, or I guess stronger than intuition, sort of she can sort of see things about people's past and futures. The book is told in two time periods, the first being when Agnès and Shakespeare first meet, and the second being when the plague enters their household. I liked how this book took a perspective, Agnès's, that has kind of been lost to history. We actually don't know that much about Shakespeare for how large of a presence he is in English literature and culture. And we really know next to nothing about Anne Hathaway, his wife, and so I like that this story brought her to life and gave her a voice and a spirit. The book is sad, obviously. It's about a child who dies of a harrowing illness. So again, you're going to know that going in, but it is also, I would say, really a meditation on grief. We see how the different members of the family deal with Hamnet's loss, and again, particularly Agnès, and how she copes and how she makes sense of it. And I would say that is kind of the main theme of the book, and I think that is done well. Like, you feel the gut-wrenching sadness from this character and this scenario. What I didn't love about this book was the style of the prose. Just kind of wasn't for me. It's very descriptive, which I can like, but in this case, something about it just wasn't really working. The style, the voice. The author tends to do a lot of description in dialogue tags, which is kind of a peculiar pet peeve of mine. Yeah, and I kind of just found the language, I struggled to buy into things as much as I wanted to, because I felt like the prose was a little bit of a roadblock for me. I also do wish I had read this book in fewer and longer sittings. I was kind of reading like a few pages at a time because it was while I was traveling for the holidays, and I would be like with my family and read like 3 pages on the couch and then have to do something else. And I think that also made it a little harder to get into the language of the text. And so I think if I'd read this in kind of longer chunks, I would have felt more immersed in the world, and that would have helped with just how I vibed with the writing style. Yeah, so for me this book was like just fine. If you are interested in kind of the historical retelling aspect, then I would recommend it. If that on its own is not calling to you, and neither are the themes of kind of the witchy womanhood or this era of time, then I would say maybe skip this one. But yeah, I'm not mad that I read it. I'm kind of like, okay, glad to hear what the fuss was all about. So those are my books of December 2025. Let me know if you've read any of them, if now you want to, or maybe there's some you want to avoid. What are you reading right now? And come back so we can talk about 2026 and what's on the docket reading-wise.